My son got married in September at a venue called Cliffside Manor, just outside of Kingston, Ontario. 300 guests. Open bar. A string quartet that played during cocktail hour. I stood at the edge of the reception hall and the dress I'd worn to my sister's retirement party 2 years before, and I watched my son laugh with people I'd never met. I had something in my purse I'd been carrying for 31 years. When the dancing started, I found him near the bar. I touched his arm and he turned, and for just a second, I saw the boy who used to fall asleep on the couch watching Hockey Night in Canada. Then his wife appeared at his elbow, and the look on his face changed. My son said, "Mom, you didn't have to bring a gift. We talked about this." I said I wanted to. I held out the envelope. It wasn't wrapped. I'd thought about wrapping it, but it felt dishonest somehow, dressing it up. His wife took it before he could. She had her nails done the color of red wine, and they clicked against the paper as she opened the flap. She pulled out what was inside, turned it over, looked at me. "Is this a bank book?" I said yes. She laughed. Not mean, not yet, just confused the way people are when they don't understand something and assume it must be worthless. She held it out to her mother, who was standing just behind her. Her mother, this woman in a beaded gown that cost more than my monthly pension, took one look and said, "Oh, how quaint, a passbook. I haven't seen one of those since my mother was alive." My son took it from her. He flipped it open, looked at the entries. He didn't say anything for a moment, and I thought maybe he sees it. Then his wife said, "Sweetheart, what is it?" And he closed it, handed it back to me. His face was careful, controlled, the way it gets when he's embarrassed and doesn't want to show it. He said, "Mom, we really can't accept this. We're doing fine." He said it like he was doing me a favor. I started to say something. I had so much I wanted to say, but his wife had already turned to greet someone else, and her mother was smiling at me the way people smile at children who said something sweet and silly, and my son was being pulled away by a photographer who needed the couple for more photos. I stood there. The passbook was in my hand. I looked at it for a moment, then put it back in my purse. I found my coat. I said goodbye to no one. I drove home on the 401 in the dark, radio off, and I didn't cry until I was inside with the door locked behind me. Quick question. Before we go any further, have you ever given someone everything you had and watched them hand it back? Drop a comment. I read everyone. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe. Some details in what follows are fictionalized for privacy, but the heart of it, that part is completely real. Now, let me tell you what was in that passbook. My apartment is on the 14th floor of a building in Scarborough. 2 bedrooms, though I've used the second one as a sewing room for 15 years. The furniture is old but clean. I have a view of the lake on clear days if I stand at the right angle in the kitchen. I've lived there since my husband left, which was 1991, when my son was 9 years old. The night I drove home from the wedding, I sat at my kitchen table with the passbook open in front of me and a cup of tea that went cold while I wasn't paying attention. The number on the last line was $214,000. That was what I'd saved. 31 years of deposits, never a withdrawal. I had started the account the year my husband left. I was working then as a cleaning woman at a medical building on Yonge Street. Monday to Friday, 5 in the morning until noon. I had a second job on weekends at a hospital laundry, and for 6 years I did both. When my son was in school, I studied at night. Bookkeeping at first, then property management licensing through George Brown. By the time he was in high school, I had my license. By the time he finished university, I was managing 7 residential buildings for a property company in Etobicoke. The passbook was my private account, my anchor. I put in $50 a week when I had it, $20 when I didn't. It was for my son. It had always been for my son. It had always been for my son. But he'd handed it back to me without even asking what was in it. I sat there until past midnight. Then I got up, went to the closet in the second bedroom, and moved aside the plastic bins of fabric and the old vacuum I keep meaning to replace. In the back, behind a box of tax returns going back to 1993, was a fireproof lockbox I bought at Canadian Tire the year I closed my first real estate deal on my own. Inside the lockbox, 11 property deeds, All residential, all in the Greater Toronto area. Bought one at a time over 22 years. Some were single-family homes I rented out. 4 were small multi-unit buildings. The combined current assessed value, according to the last municipal notices, was just over $4.3 million. I had never told my son. Not because I wanted to hide it, because I wanted him to grow up understanding that you build something with your hands and your time and your choices. I wanted him to respect work. I wanted him to look at me, a woman who cleaned office bathrooms for years, and understand that what a person does for money says nothing about who they are. Instead, he'd grown up a little ashamed of me. I watched it happen slowly, the way you watch a plant turn toward a different window. He was 12, the first time he didn't want me to volunteer at the school because I might run into his friends. He was 16 when he stopped mentioning to people that his mother worked in building maintenance. By the time he started at Queen's University, he'd learned to say property management, which was technically true by then, and said it with a kind of relief. His wife came from money. Her family had a house in Forest Hill and a cottage on Georgian Bay and opinions about everything. Her mother had made it clear from the first dinner we shared that she found me a little rough around the edges, though she never said it that plainly. My son loved his wife. I believe that. But he had also married into something he'd always wanted, and part of what he'd wanted was distance from where he started. The morning after the wedding, I made a decision. I called my property manager. Her name is Wendy, and she has worked with me for 9 years and knows more about my buildings than I do. I told her I wanted to make some changes. She listened. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're sure?" I said I was sure. Then I called my accountant and my lawyer. Both of them have offices in North York. Both of them have known me long enough to not ask too many questions when I have that particular tone in my voice. That afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table with a fresh cup of tea and the lockbox open in front of me, I started making a list. 10 days after the wedding, I had coffee with a woman named Bev. Bev runs a small private investigation firm out of Mississauga. She was recommended to me by my lawyer, who said she was discreet and thorough. We met at a Tim Hortons near Square One. She was maybe 55, short gray hair, sensible boots. She ordered a large double-double and didn't write anything down, just listened. I told her about my son-in-law. His name is Preston. He works in financial services, some kind of senior analyst position at a firm downtown on Bay Street. He and my daughter-in-law, my son's wife, her name is Adrienne. They'd been together 3 years before the wedding. I had never trusted Preston. He was polished in a way that felt practiced, the kind of smooth that comes from knowing exactly what people want to hear. He had an opinion about wine, and he expressed it often. He wore a watch that cost more than most people's car payments. I had no proof of anything. I just had a feeling, the kind that a woman who spent her whole life paying attention to things other people overlook tends to develop. Bev said, "What do you want me to find?" I said, "Whatever's there." She called me 12 days later. We met again at the same Tim Hortons. She put a folder on the table between us and let me open it myself. Preston's salary was documented at $112,000 a year. His lifestyle, as Bev had estimated it from what was visible and searchable, ran to roughly $200,000. The gap was being covered somehow. His personal bank records she couldn't access directly, but there were other threads she pulled. 3 credit cards, all near their limits. A line of credit at one of the big banks that had been drawn down almost entirely. A condo in his name purchased 2 years before he met my daughter-in-law, now carrying a mortgage he was barely servicing. And one other thing, a woman, not romantic, financial. Preston had been borrowing money from someone, a private individual, not a bank, through what looked like an informal arrangement. The amounts were significant. Bev didn't have the full picture, but she had enough. She said, "This is the shape of a man who is managing, but barely. One disruption, and the whole thing falls over." I asked if my daughter-in-law knew. Bev said she saw no indication of that. Adrienne's own finances appeared to be separate. Her family money, her own income, none of it was entangled with Preston's situation. I thanked Bev. I paid her in cash. I went home and sat with the folder for 3 nights. I had 2 choices. I could go to my son. tell him what Beth had found. He would not believe me. He would say I was jealous of his wife's family, that I had never approved of Adrian, that I was trying to interfere. He would repeat this to Adrian, and she would repeat it to Preston, and I would lose my son entirely. Or I could wait. Let what was happening happen, and be there when it landed. I chose to wait, and I chose to do something else first. There is a building on Kingston Road in Scarborough, a 3-story walk-up, 40 years old, 12 units. I have owned it for 11 years. I bought it for $360,000 when everyone told me the area was declining. The area did not decline. The building is now worth just under $900,000, and it runs at full occupancy. The reason it runs at full occupancy is that I charge rents that are below market. Always have. The tenants are nurses and transit workers and home care aides, and one retired postal worker named Glennis, who has been there since before I bought the building and whom I would never in my life raise the rent on. I had been watching a property come available on the same street, a former commercial space, previously a laundromat and then a dollar store, that had been sitting vacant for 3 years. The owner wanted to sell. We'd been in early conversations. I made an offer 2 days after my meeting with Bev. The plan I had in mind for that space was going to take time, but it felt right. It felt like the right thing to do with what I built. My son called me 3 weeks after the wedding. First time he'd called since. He said, "Mom, I hope you're not upset about the gift thing. We just felt it wasn't appropriate to accept something like that." I said, "I understand." He said, "Adrian's mother thought it was a bit unusual." I said, "I imagine she did." There was a pause. He asked if I was coming to their place for Thanksgiving. I said I'd let him know. I didn't tell him about the building on Kingston Road. I didn't tell him about the building on Kingston Road. I didn't tell him about Bev's folder. I didn't tell him about the lockbox in the back of my sewing room. I just said I hoped they were settling in well, and I meant it even then. 6 weeks after the wedding, things started to move. Preston's employer, the firm on Bay Street, conducted what I later learned was a routine internal compliance review. These happen. In financial services in Canada, they happen regularly. What is not routine is when such a review turns up anomalies in client account reporting. I did not cause this review. I want to be clear about that. I had nothing to do with it. What I had done was contact the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada and submit, through their formal tip line, the information Beth had gathered, organized clearly with specific references to dates and amounts. I submitted it 6 weeks before the review happened. Whether the timing was related, I don't know for certain, but I'm also not naive. My son called me on a Thursday evening in November. His voice was different. The careful, controlled quality was gone. He said, "Mom, something's happening with Preston's work. There's some kind of investigation. Adrian is really upset." He paused. "She thinks someone reported him." I said, "That must be very hard for her." He said, "Do you know anything about this?" I said, "I know that the Financial Consumer Agency takes tips from the public seriously." The silence on the other end lasted a long time. He said, "Mom, what did you do?" I said, "I did what anyone should do when they have information about someone harming other people." Preston's clients are real people, sweetheart. Their savings are real money. He hung up. Adrian called 10 minutes later. I let it ring. "Here's what I need you to understand about who I am and why I made the choices I made. I grew up in a small town in northern Ontario near Sudbury. My father worked at the nickel mine. My mother cleaned houses for the families whose husbands managed the mine. I watched my mother be invisible to people for my entire childhood. She was good at her work, careful and thorough, and the women she worked for respected her the way people respect a reliable appliance. She died at 68 of a stroke, and 2 of the families she'd worked for sent flowers to the funeral home, which I appreciated even then and still think about now. I did not want my son to be one of those people, the ones who see the cleaner but not the person. I thought I had more time to show him who I was. I thought there would be a natural moment. I had imagined it sometimes, telling him about the buildings, watching his face change. I had been too patient, And now things were moving faster than I planned. My son did not call me back for 11 days. When he did, it was a Saturday morning. His voice was quieter than I'd heard it in years. He said, "Adrian and I need to talk to you. Can we come to your place?" I said yes. They arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Adrian looked like she hadn't slept properly in weeks. Preston was not with them, which I had not expected. My son sat on the couch I've had since 2003. Adrian sat beside him, very straight, a kind of dignity in the way she held herself that I had not given her credit for before. She said, "My mother told me at the wedding that your gift was inappropriate." She said it in a way that implied it was nothing. I believed her. She was quiet for a moment. "I shouldn't have let that happen. You came to our wedding and I let my mother make you feel small in front of everyone." I looked at my son. He was looking at the floor. He said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I handed it back without even looking at it properly. I should have." He tried again. "I've been thinking about it since November, since the call. I keep remembering your face when I handed it back." I went to the kitchen and came back with the passbook. I set it on the coffee table between us. My son picked it up this time. He opened it. He looked at the entries, all the dates, $50, $50, $20, $50, $20, going back to 1993. He looked at the final balance. He looked up at me. He said, "Mom, this is," I said, "it was always for you." Adrian was very still. Then she said, "The balance is $214,000. I said, "Yes." She said, "You saved this on a cleaning salary?" I said, "And a laundry salary, and eventually a property management salary, yes?" My son said, "Property management." I said, "I have my license, have had it since 1999. I also have a few properties." He said, "What do you mean a few properties?" He said, "What do you mean a few properties?" I went back to the sewing room. I came back with the lockbox. I unlocked it at the coffee table and set the deeds out, one at a time, 11 of them. I named each one. Address, year purchased, current approximate value. I watched my son's face as I went through the list. Adrian had her hand over her mouth before I got to the 5th one. When I finished, my son said, $4 million. I said 4.3 roughly, depending on the market. He said, "How? How did you lived in this apartment? You always said money was tight." I said, "Money was tight in 1993 and in 1996 and for several years after that. But I was building something and I didn't want that to influence how you saw me. I wanted you to know me as your mother, not as someone with assets." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I've been ashamed of you." His voice broke on the word. 4 years. I was ashamed that you cleaned buildings and I told people you were in property management like it was a different thing, like cleaning was something to hide. I said, "I know." He said, "You knew." I said, "A mother always knows, sweetheart." Adrian said quietly, "What did you plan to do with it? The passbook money?" I said, "It was always going to you. Both of you, if you wanted it. But I needed to know who you were first." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "And Preston?" I said, "That was separate. Preston was stealing from people who couldn't afford to lose what he took from them. That had nothing to do with my feelings about my family." Still with me? If you've ever felt invisible because of your job, drop invisible in the comments. I want to know how many of us there are, and stay with me, because what happened next changed things in a way I hadn't planned. The investigation into Preston took several months. He was terminated from his position in January. By March, there were formal regulatory proceedings. By May, he and Adrian had separated, which I had not wished for. Not exactly, though I cannot honestly say I was surprised. What I hadn't anticipated was Adrian. She called me in February after the termination, but before the separation. She asked if she could come and see me. She came on a Sunday afternoon. She sat in the same spot on the couch as before, but she sat differently, without the stiffness. She said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." I said I would. She said, "Did you know, at the wedding, what he was?" I said, "I had a feeling." I had information I had gathered that suggested he was in financial difficulty and that some of that difficulty might involve his clients. I acted on that information. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "You would not have believed me." She was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. She said, "No, I wouldn't have. My mother would have said you were jealous. I probably would have believed her." I said, "That's not a criticism. I want to be clear. I'm not angry with you about the wedding. You were surrounded by people who had already decided who I was." She said, "My mother has opinions." I said, "I know. I also know that you came here alone today, which tells me something about who you are when you're not surrounded by those opinions." She left 2 hours later. She thanked me at the door. The handshake became something a little more than a handshake. I didn't call it a hug exactly, but it was close. My son came the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, we started having dinner together, nothing formal, just food and the television and the particular quiet of people who are relearning each other after a long time. I told him about the building on Kingston Road, the former laundromat space I'd purchased. I told him my plan for it. I had been approved for a renovation permit to convert the ground floor into a community resource space, a not-for-profit partnership with a local organization that supports newcomers to Canada, specifically women who are new to the country and entering or re-entering the workforce. My plan was a combination of workspace, short-term storage for small businesses, and a resource library with computers and access to settlement services. The upper floor I was converting into 4 small, affordable rental units. My son sat at my kitchen table listening to all of this. When I finished, he said, "How long have you been planning this?" I said, in some form, for about 10 years. Concretely, since September. "Since the wedding," he said. I said, "That's right." He said, "Mom." He stopped. Tried again. "I told people you were in property management as if it was something better than cleaning. I thought I was upgrading your story, but you were building things, real things, and I was too busy being embarrassed to see it." I said, "You see it now." He said, "I want to help, if you'll let me. I don't know much about this kind of project, but I can learn." I looked at my son, 41 years old, sitting in my kitchen on a Sunday night. He had his father's eyes and his grandmother's stubbornness and something of his own that I'd been waiting a long time to see. I said, "There's a city permit process that needs someone to manage the correspondence. It's paperwork mostly, but it matters." He said, "I can do that." I said, "I know you can." The resource space on Kingston Road opened in late spring. There was no ribbon, no mayor, no event. The organization that partnered with me brought in their first group of clients on a Tuesday morning. I was there in work clothes to help move in some furniture. My son was there with a box of files and a look on his face that I hadn't seen since he was small, before the embarrassment had settled in, when he still thought I was the most capable person he'd ever met. One of the women who came in that first morning was a Somali woman in her late 40s, I guess, though I didn't ask. She had come to Canada the year before with 2 of her daughters. She was a trained accountant in her home country and was working through the credential recognition process while doing cleaning work to support her family. She shook my hand, looked around at the space, at the computers and the shelves of resources and the light coming through the windows, and said in careful, precise English, "This is a good thing you have done here." I said, "So is what you're doing." She smiled at that. My son was watching from across the room. When she moved away, he came over and stood beside me, and we looked at the room filling up with people. He said quietly, "I has been such an idiot." I said, "You have had your moments." He laughed, the real laugh, not the performed one. I hadn't heard it in so long I'd forgotten what it sounded like. That evening, I walked home along Kingston Road, past the buildings I've owned for years, past the houses I watch over, past the lives that are happening inside them, people I will never meet, but who sleep safely and wake up in the morning because someone, once, decided the building was worth maintaining. I got home, made tea, sat at the kitchen table. The passbook is still in the lockbox. My son and his wife have separated. There are things I still don't know how to say out loud. There are repairs we've started but haven't finished. But we're in the same room now, and that matters. I'm 63 years old. I have cleaned other people's floors. I have managed other people's properties. I have saved $214,000 and $50 at a time, and I have built something from nothing in a country that gave me the chance to do it. And I did not do it in spite of the work. I did it because of the work, because the work taught me everything worth knowing. My son called a cleaning woman his mother for 20 years and was ashamed of it. Now he's learning what that woman actually built. That's not nothing. That's everything. If this story stayed with you, I want to hear why. Leave a comment. Tell me if you felt underestimated. Tell me if you've watched someone you love finally see you. Share this with someone who needs to hear that where you start has nothing to do with where you get to go. Thank you for being here until the end. Your time means something, and I don't take it lightly. It wasn't a small thing. It never was. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that September evening, not in any grand or philosophical sense, just in the plain practical way that you think about things when you're 63 and you've had enough time to watch your own choices come back around. Preston didn't end up in a regulatory hearing because I was angry. He ended up there because he made decisions one after another over a long period of time that harmed real people. I simply paid enough attention to see it. That's the part I want to be honest about, because it would be easy to frame what I did as revenge, and it wasn't. Revenge is about making yourself feel better. What I did was about the clients whose retirement savings he was quietly draining. People like the ones who live in my buildings. People like my mother was. What happens to us when we stop paying attention to each other matters. That's not a philosophy. That's just true. What I did wrong, and I think about this too, was waiting so long to show my son who I was. I told myself I was teaching him something about the value of work by keeping the properties quiet, by living simply, by not making the money visible. But I think part of it was fear. I was afraid that if he knew, he would love the money and not me, or that the money would make him careless in ways he wasn't yet. I protected him from the truth of what I'd built, and in doing that, I left a gap that other people's opinions filled in. His wife's mother stepped into that gap, and I had practically handed her the door. Adrienne surprised me. That's the honest truth. I had already written a version of her in my head that turned out to be wrong. She had been shaped by her mother's voice for a long time, the same way my son had been shaped by his own shame. But when that scaffolding came down, when Preston's situation stripped away the version of their life she'd been living inside, she had to find out who she was without it. And what I found, across a kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, was someone with more steadiness in her than I'd expected. That's the thing about people. They're almost never only the worst moment you've witnessed from them. My son is learning that you don't inherit character. You build it the same way you build anything else, by showing up, doing the work, making the unglamorous choices over and over until they become who you are. He's managing permit correspondence for the Kingston Road project. He is not good at it yet. He asks me questions I would have expected him to know the answers to, but he asks them, and that's the part that matters. The passbook is still in the lockbox. $214,000? It belongs to him when he's ready, and I think he's becoming ready, not because something unlocked in him the night I laid out the deeds on the coffee table, but because he's been showing up every week since then, doing things that are smaller than he imagined his life would be. And discovering that small things done well have a weight to them that impressive things done carelessly never will. Glennis, my long-term tenant, knocked on my door last month with a plate of butter tarts. She said she'd heard something was happening on Kingston Road and wanted to know if it was true. A resource base was opening. I told her it was. She said her granddaughter had just arrived from the Philippines and was looking for help with credential recognition. I wrote down the name of the organization I partnered with and gave it to her. That's it. That's the whole story. A plate of butter tarts and a piece of paper and someone's granddaughter getting a slightly better foothold. I didn't build $4 million worth of property by doing one large thing. I built it by doing one small thing and then another for 31 years. The same is true of everything that matters. Show up, pay attention, do the work in front of you. What it adds up to will surprise you.